So 100 years ago today, a minister in Prague named Norbert Čapek wanted to reimagine worship for his community. He'd been raised Catholic, became a Baptist, became a few other things along the way, and was a bit of a seeker in his way. And over the years, he'd read a lot of history, especially religious history, and about the religious conflicts in his own country. And he wanted to move towards greater religious freedom and tolerance. We know, because we do have the letters, that he reached out to the American Unitarians, but it wasn't until he moved here that he was able to join a Unitarian church, meet with the American Unitarian leadership, and build that relationship. And so after the First World War, he and his wife Maya returned to Prague, and they founded the Liberal Religious Fellowship. And that fellowship included people who had been Catholic, who had been Protestant, and even some people who had been Jews. And so bread communion, the bread and wine, was not an option. And he didn't want to remind his people of things that had historically and even presently divided them. He wanted to bring them together in all their beauty, diversity, and glory. And so he wanted to make something new, and he created the flower celebration. And he probably wasn't the first person to design something like this. A bouquet of flowers kind of lends itself to this interpretation, and we think there were probably something like flower communions in Unitarian churches prior to this. But we remember him, and he's become part of our story because of the way it was celebrated and how quickly it spread. And so each of us is going to bring a flower, and we're going to create an enormous bouquet in the front. And these flowers can come from a garden, from the roadside, from a shop, or maybe you picked it up on the way in. Each flower is beautiful in and of itself. Each flower has its own color, fragrance, size, and shape. Each of us brings who we are into this community. We bring our gifts, we bring our beauty, our own unique being and wholeness. And then we come together, and together we create something that is more than the sum of its parts. We combine our gifts and our beauty into one community. And it's not a full and permanent merging because we do always remain ourselves. And ultimately, we will separate again. But this flower celebration reminds us that over and over, week after week, we come together for a time to build this community, and then we emerge into the world. And our time together changes us. And so after this bouquet is gathered at the front, each of us will receive a flower again, a different one than the one we brought. And this is not just a historical reenactment to remember what Čapek did in Prague. This is a moment to meditate on who we are. This is a moment to think about ourselves as a community of transformation. The gifts we receive from others are transformative, and we, in our turn, transform the lives of others in our community. And so today we will notice what's happening every Sunday. We woke up and we chose to come. We chose to be here with one another when we could have chosen to do something else. This morning we chose to show up in the fullness of our being, knowing that even though it is imperfect, for this time we are held and loved by our chosen family. And so we will now begin our flower communion. When the music begins, you will come forward and you will bring your flowers. You'll offer it to the larger bouquet, and I'll bring the vases right down there. And as you come up, think about all that you have given to this community. The phone calls, the visits, the committee service, the just gloriousness of your presence. And also bring all that you are, your joys this morning, your sorrows this morning, all the concerns and hopes and anxieties on your heart, and we will hold them here as we build our bouquet together.
As Katie mentioned at the end of our service during the postlude, we will complete the flower communion by coming forward and taking from a flower from the altar as we leave the sanctuary. But before we complete the ritual, let's complete the story. The rest of the story of Norbert Čapek and the flower communion. We know that Čapek celebrated that first flower communion in Prague on June 4th, 1923. In the aftermath of World War I, the people of Prague were struggling to rebuild from the war's devastation, and Čapek sought a ritual that would unite his diverse congregation in a sense of joyful, beautiful purpose. That spring, as the hills and fields around Prague bloomed with wildflowers, he got his inspiration for the flower communion. I'm thinking about that super bloom that they had out in California this spring, right? Now, during the years between World War I and World War II, the Prague congregation flourished and grew to be the largest Unitarian church in the world, 3,200 members. But with the rise of fascism, the people of Prague were threatened once again by war and devastation. In 1939, the Germans occupied Czechoslovakia and set up a puppet regime. Before long, Čapek came under scrutiny from the Gestapo, who suspected him of disloyalty. Things got so bad for Čapek that the American Unitarian Association here in Boston offered to escort him to safety here in the States. Čapek declined, but his wife Maya did come and settled here in Boston while raising money for the Czech people. In March 1941, Čapek was finally arrested by the Gestapo on charges of treason, and he was sent to Dachau. There he was assigned to a special prison block for religious leaders who opposed the Nazi regime. The Nazis subjected the dissenting clergy to starvation and torture, but did allow them to celebrate religious ceremonies. Now, the Dachau clergy were an interfaith bunch: Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, even Muslims. And while each celebrated the liturgies of his own faith in that prison block, there was no ritual they could share together until Čapek suggested the ceremony that he had created for his own religiously diverse congregation. So one day in 1942, we don't know which day, the clergy prisoners of Dachau each found a flower, whatever flower or shred of plant life they could find among the weeds of Dachau. And they gathered for a time of silence and prayer, and then they brought forth their flowers and shared them with one another. We've perhaps read about Olivier Messiaen performing his Quartet for the End of Time in a Nazi prisoner of war camp, or the cellist of Sarajevo playing Tommaso Albinoni's Adagio amidst the rubble of his city. It seems to me that Čapek's humble flower communion at Dachau is of a similar spirit. These expressions of beauty amidst suffering are not naive or sentimental. They're fierce. They represent a fierce need within us to claim our humanity in the midst of dehumanization. A fierce desire to create and behold beauty in the midst of the world's ugliness. A fierce longing to affirm our solidarity as human beings in the midst of powerful forces that would tear us apart. we must summon this fierceness for life still. Now. Records show that the Nazis imprisoned 2,720 clergy at Dachau, of whom about 1,034 were put to death. On October 30th, 1942, Norbert Čapek joined their number. But Čapek's wife and Unitarian colleagues didn't learn of his death until 3 years later, in December 1945. Maya was still living here, working at the Unitarian Church in New Bedford. Čapek's death was received with particular sadness here at First Parish. You see, our minister, Leslie Pennington, knew Čapek and first introduced the flower communion to this congregation in November 1939, just after the German occupation of Prague. This is believed to be the very first time that flower communion was celebrated in the United States, outside of Czechoslovakia. Perhaps because of this unique relationship, Maya Čapek visited First Parish on May 19th, 1946, just a few months after learning of her husband's death, to herself lead the flower communion ceremony here with us at First Parish. A portion of Miss Čapek's message to the congregation was printed in the newsletter of May 1946, and I want to thank Gloria Korsman for sharing it with me. Miss Čapek said in part, Dr. Čapek created the flower communion service as a festival of brotherhood, her word. Just as no two flowers are alike, so no two people are alike. Yet each can help to make the world as beautiful as this bouquet. Organized and growing into a true brotherhood, we are ready to serve one another, our nation, our world. And by exchanging flowers, we signify that we are willing to march together in search of truth, in spite of all that divides us. The May 1946 newsletter further notes that at the service that Sunday, Miss Čapek gave the prayer and Reverend Pennington the sermon, and that the service concluded with a small ceremony to welcome new members into the church. Amen.